This is the final session of the day as part of the Foreign Policy Initiative's conference, Advancing and Defending Democracy. My name is Jamie Fly. I'm the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. Some of you have been with us for a long day of panels, so I'm happy that you stayed on. This session is called Voices of Freedom, a Conversation with Dissidents, and it's going to be moderated by Jeff Gedmin, President of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Jeff has been at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty since early 2007. Before assuming that role, he was director of the Aspen Institute in Berlin, and prior to joining Aspen, he was executive director of the New Atlantic Initiative of the American Enterprise Institute. We're very excited that Jeff was able to join us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce the panelists and get us going.
Well, Jamie, thank you very much, and warmest thanks to Foreign Policy Initiative. Welcome to everybody here at the W Hotel in Washington, and welcome to C-SPAN audiences. We have a terrific program titled A Conversation, Voices of Freedom, A Conversation with Dissidents, and we have two leaders from two leading countries. First, to my left, Saad, Eddin Ibrahim, who is a sociologist, a writer, a scholar, currently affiliated with Drew University, last year I think with Harvard University, and is not only in Egypt the leading, I would say, voice on behalf of a liberal order, an order of pluralism, of tolerance, of respect for diversity, but because of his writing and because of his intellectual heft, well known for exactly this kind of work and advocacy throughout the greater Middle East. So, Saad, welcome to you, and we look forward to hearing from you in just a few moments.
Thank you.
And then to my right, Ali Afshari, who similarly has a distinguished career in writing, also political activism and advocacy. Both our colleagues tonight have spent time in the West, in their home countries, and I'm sorry to say in prison, both of you, arrested for values that you care deeply about and that you fight for. Ali has been involved in political campaigning, including for then President Khatami of Iran, among student groups in particular, and is an eloquent voice and spokesman for the reform-minded cause of the liberal reform in Iran today. So, Ali, welcome to you, and we're delighted to have you. It seems to me that there are a number of things that we'll want to talk about, but I'd like to start, Saad, with you, if I may. It seems to me that one thing that we in Washington are guilty of is always looking to the past for a model for the present and future. And if you read the op-ed pages in the United States and go to think tanks and meet with people in various agencies of government, they will often say, well, we've done this before. We know how to help and support dissidents. We know how to promote democracy because we did it during the Cold War. Well, we did, and it seems to me there must be lessons we can learn, but it also seems to me that there must be differences. After all, we're talking about, at least in this panel principally, about the greater Middle East and countries with Muslim majorities in a different time with different media. Could you talk to us a little bit about what the differences are and how you engage Western and American policymakers on what history tells us and what's different now?
Well, the cause is the same. Fighting for democracy and freedom and defense of human rights is a common cause in the Middle East as it was in Eastern and Central Europe, as it is anywhere else in the world. But the way to help dissidents has to be particularized, has to be country-based cases. Because you have, for example, on this panel, two major countries in the Middle East. Both of them are very important, pivotal countries, as I say. But the relationship with the U.S. is different. In the case of Egypt, it is a friendly dictatorship, friendly authoritarian regime, friendly with the U.S. as a government, not with the U.S. as a people. In the case of Iran, and of course my colleague can speak about it, at least the way it looks is that it is with a hostile regime. And therefore, while the case in Iran is probably more clear-cut, in the case of Egypt, it is more nuanced and confused.
Well, maybe we could start there with Egypt for a moment, and then we'll come over to you, Ali, about Iran and the neighboring countries. What do you say to people in West European capitals of the United States who say, listen, Saad, Ibrahim, we believe in freedom and democracy, and we support you. We're sympathetic to your cause, but we have other equities. We care about the peace process. We care about stability. We care about fighting terrorism. We think that what is in place in Egypt is autocratic, but maybe it's the best deal we can get right now. Maybe it's realistic. What do you say to people like that?
Well, I'd say that you have tried these autocratic regimes in the case of Egypt for the last 28 years. And what have you gotten out of it? Nothing. Nothing in the peace process, not 1 inch beyond what the late President Saad accomplished. Not 1 iota. And yet, the regime is using its role in the peace process to keep the pressure off. Number 2, the regime has skillfully recognized that there is what I would say pathological fear of Islamists. So it used the incident of a good showing by Hamas in Palestine or the Muslim Brothers somewhere else in the Middle East to frighten you. And instead of being frightened, you should have spoken to the true Democrats who stand exactly in between the autocrats, the likes of the Mubarak regime, and the theocrats, the likes of, let's say, the mullahs in Iran, I don't want to speak on behalf of Ali, or the Taliban in Afghanistan. So in the public space, between the autocrats and the theocrats, there is a budding force. And that budding force is the Democrats.
And how would you recommend one, in the case of Egypt specifically, how does one support them? Do they need material support? Do they need money? Do they need rhetorical support? Should it come from the bully pulpit of the President of the United States? What kind of support is productive? What kind of support could be counterproductive?
All the above, but ask them. Ask the dissident, ask the democratic activist of what they need. I cannot speak on behalf of all of them. I can speak myself. I need moral support first and foremost. I would demand that the American administration, whether it is a Republican or a Democratic administration, to use creative conditionality with an autocratic regime, because it's a friendly regime, and say, well, you are friendly, but this is our values, and we stand by it, and we have a constituency in our own country, in the U.S., that demands that our friends should observe the minimum standards of human rights and of democracy. And you have done that with the Soviet bloc before. You have done that with Helsinki in 1975, when the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc needed food, trade, aid, technology. You said yes. The NATO countries told the Warsaw countries at the time, we will advance all of the above if you open up your public space. And when they did, and they signed on the dotted line, that was the beginning of the dismantling of both authoritarianism and totalitarianism in Eastern and Central Europe. We demand something like that. It doesn't have to be exactly, but the spirit of this creative kind of conditionality should be put in place.
So try to articulate some set of standards and have some measure of accountability.
Absolutely.
Okay. Ali, over to you. Let me pick up from one thing that Saad said, which puzzles me or maybe bewilders me. It makes sense, but I find it difficult. And that was Saad's point. If you want to help support and work with dissidents from these kinds of countries, listen to them and listen to what they do want. Now, as you know, as president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we broadcast to Iran. We are not permitted by that regime to have a bureau inside the country. So out of Prague, where our headquarters sits, we have 40 distinguished Iranian colleagues. I ask them frequently, what should the United States do? What should Western policymakers do? What is the right set of policies or the right formula to support the democratically minded opposition movement? But the problem is, you know what the problem is going to be. We've got people as young as 25 and old as 75. Some came out of the country this year. Some came out 30 years ago. Some were social democrats. Some were Greens. Some were Christian Democrats. Some want a parliamentary democracy. Some want a presidential democracy. Some want a monarchy. They all want decent, accountable government. But Saad, when I asked them, that very diverse, very complex group of people who want democracy in some way, what should we do? How do we support you? We get very different reactions. It's understandable that we're not dealing with monoliths, but how does one puzzle through that sort of thing?
Right, good questions. Let me look at the recent struggle in Iran. If you see and follow that struggle, it's a non-ideological struggle, and all different peoples, different generations, different ideology, different cultural view, they come together and they just want freedom, better life, and human rights in Iran. And there is a consensus about that. The problem that you mentioned on that, it's more among the diaspora outside of the Iran. But also recently there is an advancement and better situation on that. If you see some protests that they have been held out of the Iran, in US, in Europe, and you can see the more people with different ideas. But in Iran, I agree with you, it's a special case in Iran, and it's not, you cannot, the similar case in the world or in the Muslim countries. It's a different case. But I think that right now, the radio, Farda, Liberty, and also Voice of America, they are successful because right now they have more audience inside Iran, and their effectiveness appeared in recent protests, and they can broke the isolation policy that the governments want to impose on that. But if I want to answer to your questions, right now I cannot talk about the whole parts of the Iranian dissidents because it's very divisive and different ideas. But there is a general consensus that support human rights and people's demands in Iran. Because right now in Obama's administration, there is a change from the past administration. I agree. The militaristic approach was unsuccessful in the last administration. But the current administration, I believe that the current policy that they don't mention to human rights and they just want to deal with the Iranian regime about the nuclear issues and stability or security issues, I think similarity, it goes in the wrong direction. And first, in this right now, it needs to focus on the human rights issue as one agenda that is not negotiables with the Iranian regime as a part of the package. And I believe that to condition on negotiation with the regime. And then I believe that to continue to some project like the giving grant to some Iranian democratic initiatives, and also supporting the Voice of America, Radio Farda, and some media like that, because the situation in Iran become worse after the post-election, and right now there is a more crackdown against the democratic activists.
Well, Ali, take the one point about how, Saad, we just spoke about how to support depends on what individuals articulate as their needs. But one thing one frequently hears about Iranian oppositionists is that if they get too much help from the West, or the wrong sort of help from the West, they're tainted. It's manipulated by the regime. It's not productive, it's counterproductive. Is that true? Or are there guidelines or limits that you would advise people in Washington, for example?
No, I don't believe that, because the regime always use that. For example, if you follow the policy of the regime, since 30 years ago, every time regime regime condemned the opposition as an agent of the U.S. For example, if you see Mr. Mousavi, he has a very left agenda, and he has no affiliation with any positive approach to U.S. But right now, regime condemned him as an agent of the U.S. and follows the Velvet Revolution in Iran. I believe no, that's not true, and it depends how U.S. Frame their policy against Iranian regime. But I believe the support is useful because if you see the reactive behavior of the regime, they fear about that, and every time they mention on that. For example, the hardliner media several times in weeks ago, they mentioned that there is possibility that we have a negotiation between Ahmadinejad and Obama in the UN Assembly gathering, and that's the sign that the regime does not want to. There is a relation between the U.S. and also being the opposition in Iran.
In the case of Iran right now, Ali, we all agree that it's not one size fits all, and each case and each time has its own particulars. In the case of Iran right now, would you advise the United States to be bold and strong rhetorically in a public manner, or would you recommend a quieter approach with back channels and reliance on the Europeans to do certain things? What do you recommend to the White House right now?
I recommend the quieter bit of cooperation, the Europe. So that's a better situation. But if they support and agree with the U.S. approach, but I believe a tough diplomacy and a strong position against Iranian regime, because Iranian regime is an authoritarian regime, and its behavior, it's flexible when it feels the more stronger pressure exists against it. If you show silent and weaker, they want more and ask more. And right now, I believe that if you see what's the Ahmadinejad say by the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei as a powerful man in the power circle says, they do not, in current situation, they don't want to compromise in the nuclear issues, and they want to continue on that. And as several times Khamenei has told, he needs to have hostile relationship with America, and he wants to become the hero of fundamentalist Muslims in the region.
Now, you mentioned the nuclear issue. I want to ask you the same question I asked Saad at the top of the program. What about the person in Paris, London, or Washington who says, listen, Ali, we care about human rights, but we have a nuclear issue to deal with? And anything that interferes or pushes that aside or draws attention away from that, we're making a mistake. We like that. We want democracy in Iran. We don't think it's happening soon. Right now, today, we have to solve the nuclear issue. How do you answer them?
I believe that it may true in short term, the nuclear issue that's more dangerous for West. But I believe that the democracy, if Iranian people found, because right now Iranians amongst the Middle East peoples has more positive approach to U.S. And if they find that the U.S. does not care about the situation, the democracy in Iran, it may be a turn and a point, and they change their mind and support the hostile approach, or anti-American approach that we had in contemporary history, that approach. And I believe in long-term U.S. damage from this approach. And also I believe that because Iran already has nuclear uranium enrichment ability, and I don't believe that anybody can stop that, because it's a software, and if even you bomb that, destroy on that, they can easily furnish on that and build again that ability. And I believe that if Iran has a democratic and rational government, nuclear issues, that's not the case. And as Israel has in the region, and Pakistan also has in region, the nuclear issues, and it's not the problem for the world.
Thank you. Saad, let me go back to you for a moment. You talked about, I think you call it the pathological fear that some of us have in the West of extremism and Islamists in some of the countries of the Middle East. First question is, you would probably concede that there's legitimate fear, however. Maybe pathological is inappropriate, but legitimate is appropriate. And second, related to that, in a country like yours, you are inspiring and convincing. But why should people in the West believe that there's a large constituency in Egypt of people like you. Could we be deceived? Not by you deceiving us, but we're hearing what we want to hear. You're a liberal. You care about liberal values. But is there a large constituency for that in today's Egypt?
Jeff, let me give you figures, facts and figures. In the last election in Egypt, fraudulent as it may have been, this was in 2005, only 23% of the registered voters voted. And this is the government figures, 23. Where are the other 77? They abstained. These are registered voters. These are middle class. And why did they abstain? Because they did not like either alternative. There was an autocratic regime that has been in power by that time nearly 25 years, corrupt, inept. And then there was an alternative, the Muslim Brother, organized, solid, coherent, but they have a vision that the majority does not like. And therefore, as we learned from Professor Lipset, whose wife is with us here, when voters are under cross pressure, they abstain. When there are two competing things or two undesirable alternatives, then choose between the undesirables. You cannot do that, you stay home. And that is the constituency that the Democrats like myself are counting on. That's the constituency that another liberal who will be here in the States in less than 2 months, Ayman Noor, of Al-Ghad Party, the party of the future, are tapping. And it is that constituency that we like Western democracies to keep propping, encouraging, and one way of encouraging it was hold your support from the dictators in the region. Even if they pose as friendly, but I don't think a dictator can ever be friendly to a democracy, a genuine democracy. So he may be expedient, opportunist, but don't believe that he is really friendly. He is there for himself.
Well, that sounds convincing as well, but it seems to me that the United States is confronted with the reality of, at times, forging tactical relationships. I don't think anybody in this room, I may be wrong, but Democrats, though that we all are, and supporters of democracy, support instantly breaking bilateral relations with Saudi Arabia and isolating or undermining the regime. Every analogy, Saad, is imperfect, and this is certainly a limping analogy. But what if someone said to you, we're for what you want, and we want to support it, but we don't want to destabilize this government. We don't want to revisit the Iran experience, where we get rid of one autocratic regime, in that case 1979 Shah, and well-intentioned as the motive was, it was a disaster, and we got something even worse. What do you say to a critic like that?
I'd say that we have, beside a negative experience like Iran, we have about 100 positive experience worldwide. From the time of the Portuguese uprising against the dictatorship back in 1974 until today, there has been 100 countries like Egypt, like Iran, who have made the transition. And only 1 or 2 made the wrong transition. And therefore, do not use that, the exceptional cases, the exceptional negative cases, to punish all the potential positive cases. And we have even countries in which Islamists ran for office, and it wasn't the end of the world. They are very responsible. In Kuwait, in Jordan, in Turkey, one of their oldest allies in the Middle East, Turkey, since the mid-40s, has been very close allies. Well, the Islamists, the Justice and Development Party, which is in the Islamist party, has run for election and has respected the rules of the game. So, as a calling for conditional, creative conditionality with the regimes, I say Western democracies should have similar creative conditionality with even social movements and other political parties in that part of the world, in the Middle East, that you will not recognize them, you will not deal with them if they do not respect the rules of the game. And you always have that card. And believe me, everybody wants to be recognized by the United States. Even those who have been professional at bashing the United States right and left, yet they want to be recognized by the United States. They realize that their legitimacy is contingent on being recognized by Western democracies. And that is not to be belittled. This is a very important card, not to mention other incentives that you can give.
Thank you. Let me ask Ali one more question that will open up to the audience for questions and comments. Ali, say a word about what is making Iranian voters tick right now. I met with an Iranian who had come right out of Tehran about 10 days ago in Europe. And this gentleman is from the capital, from Tehran. He comes from science, hard science. He described himself as previously apolitical, not terribly involved in any particular cause or campaign. And he told me that he, his family, his friends, his colleagues are now highly motivated politically. He told me that the regime had gone too far, lied too much, and crossed red lines, and he would never accept this government again. That's one individual, an educated individual who had come out briefly to Europe. Is that representative? What could you tell us through your alliances, your networks, your source of information about what is making Iranians tick right now, a couple months after the elections this summer?
Okay. Interesting issues that I would like to talk about that. Right now, the situation is different than before the election. Before the election, people want to vote because they want to just reject Ahmadinejad. But after the election and what's happened in Iranian's political sphere, they changed to some semi-revolutionary situation. And people want to more radical change inside the political structure. And what you told about the gentleman that recently came out of Iran, it's true because it's very interesting that a new part of the society, especially among the youth generation, that they didn't have any interest to politics in recent years, they politicized during these green movements. And they are the new army of democracy in Iran. And as the Quds rally in Tehran showed that, the movement is alive. And all efforts of the regime to killing people, to arresting them, to forcing them to forced confession, to raping, all of that efforts has not been successful and cannot stop people to continue the struggles. And I believe that the regime, and especially Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, they lost totally their legitimacy inside the society. And they just control of the intelligence service, military, especially Revolutionary Guards. What's their factors for survive? But definitely it cannot work for a long term. And also another interesting issue is the gap between the clergy and the government. In the Quds, because in Shia's custom, high clergy should see by his eye or by eye of his agents the moon to declare the Eid Fitr. But just Khamenei announced the Sunday as a Fitr Eid. But the other high-ranking clergy, all of them announced Monday would be Eid Fitr. And it shows that the gap between the clergy and the government. Right now,
and there are presumably gaps within the clergy too now, rather significant divisions.
Exactly, divisions, and they no longer support the regime, especially the Khamenei's approach. And they believe that he should be changed, or he should be changed his policy and his mind. And I believe for that reason, regime is not as strong as before, and there is a much more possibility for a change in Iran.
Okay. Well, that's an exciting prospect. I think with that, Ali, thank you, and Saad, I think we should turn it over to our audience and invite our distinguished guests to ask questions. And if you would please identify yourself.
Hi, Abe Greenwald of the Foreign Policy Initiative. I have a question for Mr. Afshari. The regime in Iran says that they're cracking down in order to preserve the principles of the revolution. Similarly, or in a mirror image, the reformers are often found talking about preserving the true spirit of the revolution. They chanted, continue to chant Allahu Akbar. What's your sense? Is there a significant portion of a reform movement outside the framework of the revolution?
Good questions. The Green Movement comes of two levels. First level is the challenge between section of the regime, section of the pro-revolutionary principles. That's, for example, Mr. Mousavi and Khamenei is a symbol of this gap between those groups. But also there is a struggle between the civil society forces and between people and state. They just want democracy and better life. At this moment, they accepted as a first step the leadership of Mousavi or the reformist part, because they showed they barely has not given up about the government and continue to struggle to them, and provided opportunity for people to show what they want in that process. But in the future, I believe that more chance is for the agenda that is outside of the frame of the regime. Maybe they inspired by some part of the revolutionary principles, but they just believe the secular democracy in Iran. And I believe that Mr. Mousavi or Mr. Karoubi, they don't have so much time to continue they keep their leadership in the situation. In the next couple of months, if they cannot succeed in this process, it will happen a new wave of some revolutionary situation in Iran will happen. And probably we will have the same experience like the constitutional movement 100 years ago in Iranian history. Also like the Islamic revolution is a kind of the velvet revolution or silent revolution. That's most capable for the situation of Iran.
Thank you. Let's take another question. This gentleman in the front row. If you wait one moment, he's going to bring a microphone to you.
This is Mukhtar Kamal from the Egyptian Coalition in Washington, D.C. This is a question for Dr. Saad. Why do you think there is a kind of seemingly great reluctance on the part of Americans to really support the liberal, pro-Western forces in the Middle East? And do you think that this counter-narrative that Americans usually give, which is stability versus change, is it an excuse, or they really believe in that?
Well, I think that question probably should be directed toward the American policymaker. But if I may take a crack at it, I think it is basically an excuse. The bureaucracy here likes to deal with the bureaucracy there, and they want to maintain the status quo. And when I say the bureaucracy, I mean State Department, American Embassy in Cairo and other capitals, the Army, the Pentagon, and speaking, with Jeff, when we were in Prague 3 years ago, 3 years ago, 2007, President Bush surprised the meeting by declaring himself. This was a meeting of democratic forces, both in Eastern Europe and in the Third World. And he said, I'm a dissident like you. So conversation was dissident, and everybody cracked. Everybody laughed, as you are laughing now. He said, oh, I mean it. I am a dissident in Washington. Do you see anybody from the State Department with me? Do you see anybody from the Pentagon with me? And he kept counting different institutions in the U.S. who are, according to him, are undermining his freedom agenda. And he said, but I still have 18 months. At the time, it was 18 months. This was June 2007. And I'm going to keep trying. What I'm really trying to say is that the bureaucracies in the U.S., as everywhere else, seem to outlive elected leaders. And unless you really overhaul the bureaucracy to serve a given policy, then the tendency is to go with the status quo. So every excuse is used, and I mentioned some of the excuses. One is the peace process. And I said this is nonsense, and if they think that Mubarak will deliver anything, we have a saying in Arabic, Asham Iblis fil Jannah. This is like the devil aspiring to go to heaven. It will not happen. And if they think that Mubarak will deliver, he did not deliver, and you probably noted when he was here 2 months ago, he kept saying, I have 2 more years. Give me a chance, I have 2 more years. If he had not delivered in 28 years, you wonder why would make him immediately deliver in 2 years. I hope he's right. I hope he will deliver. Maybe he had something up his sleeve. But keep saying this is like the devil's aspiration to go to heaven. The other thing that is often already noted is that fear of the Islamists, something that even as a secularist myself, I do not share. And because I know that if a fair and free election is conducted in Egypt today, according to our straw polling, both in the last election and other elections, the maximum they will get is 30%. And if they get 30%, they should be entitled to 30% of the seats in parliament. But it is not the majority, and they will not be able to rule. That is my stand. But in order to convince the establishment in Western democracies of all the above, it is taking me a lot of time, and it is an uphill fight. So I hope everybody here in this audience will at least debate these issues and put it on the agenda. And as I said, whatever you are afraid of, put it on the agenda. Let people do. Which takes me to one of the questions that Ali was trying to answer. And for Radio Free Europe and other media, what if there are many voices in Iran? What if there are many voices in Egypt? Even if you could not find a consensus, I think these voices should be reflected. That is the essence of pluralism. That is the essence of democracy. Let people in the West know there are more voices in Iran, in Egypt, and elsewhere in the Middle East. And, as I said, so long as they respect the rules of the game, put them to the test and make your continuous dealing or transacting with them contingent on respecting the rules of the democratic game.
Well, it's certainly the essence of debate and pluralism in the United States. Thank you. Next question, Mark Plattner.
Mark Plattner, Journal of Democracy. I have a question for Saad Ibrahim. Even establishments who favor the status quo face the problem that leaders who head the status quo don't live forever. And Egypt, as you pointed out, now has a ruler who's been in power for 28 years and is aging, and there's likely to be a change in Egypt in some way in the next few years, whether the establishments want it or not. I'm just wondering if you might be able to say anything about if a change takes place at the top, what the role of the U.S. government, Western governments might be, and whether that would be an opportunity when people who want to support democracy might be able to take an active role.
Thank you, Mark, for the question. Egyptians like to joke in politics. And the latest joke was on the last birthday of Mubarak, which is May 4th. And he reached 84 years of age. And the joke is that he was given a tortoise, a turtle. Yes, as a gift. And he said, what is so particular about getting this? So somebody said, well, it lives to over 120 years. He said, really? We'll see. So the guy has aspiration for immortality. He does not think that he will die or that he will depart the sin, but assuming that he will, because his father died at the age of 94. So he comes from a family that lives a long time. But having conveyed that, I think there are three standing scenarios on the scene right now. One scenario is the inheritance scenario, the North Korean scenario, the Kim Il-sung scenario, and that is the leader installing his son to inherit the power after him. This is one scenario that the entire family and the ruling party are working to implement to make it real. The second scenario is an army takeover, because the army has been really the ruler behind the scene or the power behind the whatever for the last 60 years, since 1952. And they may not accept the son, Gamal Mubarak Jr., to be the ruler, especially because he is not very popular with the Egyptian people, for reasons that we may not get into right now. And then the third scenario is a national front scenario. And that is a scenario that Mukhtar and I and many Egyptians in the audience are working for. And that is to get the liberal democratic forces, the whatever parties are on the scene, to create a front and to assume power, probably with the help of some kind of a popular uprising or whatever, to prepare the country in the next 4 to 5 years for a true democratic governance. And the transitional model for going from non-democratic to democratic has been again tried in those many countries that I mentioned before, including, let's say, Chile, Argentina, and so on. So Portugal, Spain. So we have models of transition that is orderly and under the international eye, watchful eye, and I think Egyptians are capable of doing it. After all, many people here may not know that Egypt had its first parliament back in 1866. That is even before Germany was created, before Italy was created. So we have tradition. Egyptians are capable. So please do not underestimate what the democratic impulses are in my country, or in the region for that matter, because not just Egypt. Ali mentioned the constitutional revolution in Iran around the turn of the 20th century, in 1904 or 6. That was a constitutional revolution. We had a similar one in Egypt 20 years earlier, and so on. So the region has all of these ingredients. It is a question of, again, enabling them to take hold and to strike roots and to be sustainable.
It seems to me, Saad, that there are two mistakes that we repeat time and again. And one mistake is falling into the trap of thinking that authoritarian regimes are stable. And history does show us that they are time and again inherently unstable, no matter how fierce or invincible they look at a certain point. And the other mistake you just alluded to, and we keep repeating that mistake, Ali, I think, time and again too. We think that a certain country or certain culture can't be capable of democracy or liberal thought because of religion or because of history or because of some particular thing that's happened in its history. But we've done that with China until Taiwan. We did that with Korea until South Korea. We did it with Latin America till Costa Rica. We did it with Africa until Botswana. We did it for some time with Germany and Japan after the war. We did it with Portugal right through the 1970s. So I wanted to add that. Let's go to another question from the audience, please. Yes, sir. Wait one moment for the microphone. Please tell us who you are.
John Hanna from the Washington Institute. I wonder if I can ask our Iranian colleague two-part question. One, what do you think? I know this is very hard to predict, but what is the likelihood that the internal process in Iran will give us a way out of the showdown we see coming over the Iranian nuclear issue? That is, will kind of save us by changing the game so dramatically that a new resolution that we don't see available now becomes available. Second, barring that kind of major discontinuity in Iran internally, what's your best feeling based on the people you're talking to of the internal reaction to either crippling sanctions from the outside world, however one defines those, or military action, most likely by Israel, but perhaps by some broader coalition? Thank you.
Okay. About your first questions, I believe that in current situation, Iranian regime, they do not give up the nuclear program. They continue on that. But the nuclear is not a final destination. It's a tool on the hand of the regime. It's some political game. And they want to use this game to reach to their security policy in the region and in the world first. And they continue and they have some check and balance between the positive and negative sides. I personally believe that if there is a very tough sanction against them, for example, to prevent them to sell oil, and I think that's the point that maybe the Iranian regime changed their policy and stopped nuclear issues. But the second part, from my contact, from my point of view, and I believe that the majority of Iranian peoples or the Iranian political activists, democratic activists, they oppose to military and especially from the Israel. And I think that may be a little bit disaster on Iran and in the region, and it increased the instability and the terrorism in the region. But about the sanction, it's divisive. Some parts believe that the sanction, some sanction, not all parts of the sanction, may be useful. Some smart sanction that just targeted the regime and do not damage a lot of people's survives and people's lives in Iran. But they need to consider human rights issues. For example, free election in Iran, not just about the nuclear issues that was the goal of the sanction. Besides the nuclear issues, also add free election in Iran, for example, and use some smart sanctions, some pressure against Iran. At the same time, continue to negotiate with Iran, but some conditional negotiations about this process. I believe that it may work in Iran.
Can I follow up to, pardon me, to John Hanna's question about military intervention? What I frequently heard before the elections in June 12th is something you alluded to. Many Iranian opposition is saying, good heavens, if you do that, it's going to push the opposition into the arms of the regime. They will find or feel that they have to stand by the country and government against a foreign intervention. Is that actually still the same today? You said many of the activists you know would oppose an intervention, but if take Israel aside, as John said, if a broader international coalition felt obliged to strike at the nuclear facilities, how would the democratic opposition react today in the new light, in the new circumstances?
Democratic opposition, they oppose to military, and also they oppose to continue the nuclear programs without the arguments of the international community. And they believe that Iran, it should be better government stop temporarily that program and give the confidence and argument of the international nuclear agency, and then continue on that. But if they oppose to war, but if the war happen, I'm not sure that they support the regime or they join to the regime, because in our contemporary history we had a situation during the Second World War. The Allies countries, Russia, Britain, and Russia, Britain, and U.S. attacked to Iran and asked the Reza Shah's position in Iran. In that time, the opposition not only did not support Reza Shah, also they supported the countries who attacked in Iran. And now I believe that Israel is different, but in the allies in the international community, if they do a war or some military approach against Iran, before that people oppose on that. But after that happened, I'm not sure that they support the regime or join to the regime and they struggle with the countries who attack Iran.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please. Ellen Bork.
Thank you. I'm Ellen Bork from the Foreign Policy Initiative. I wonder if both of you would share a little bit of your perspective on being a political prisoner. Mr. Afshari, particularly now, what you think people are going through inside Iran. And would both of you talk a little bit about what you think the difference is when foreign countries intervene on your behalf? Does it make a difference, and what should they do?
Okay. Yeah, sorry, political prisoner right now or in my personal experience, you mean?
His personal.
My personal.
Your personal
yeah.
experience.
My personal experience, I was arrested several times, but the longest one, it's 2 years continuously, but the toughest one, that was for 1 year continuously. I was in solitary confinement and I was tortured physically and psychologically. In that time, they condemned me and sentenced me to efforts to overthrowing the regime by using the American agenda. In that time, they believed there was a plan to ask the Iranian regime. George Tenet, the former head of the CIA, he designed that plan and sent to Iran, and the agent brought to me and for such activists like me, because in that time I was a student leader in Iran. And they forced me to do a confession, TV confession, and talks about that plan. And that's interesting. They gave me papers by the Kayhan press, a hardliner press in Iran, and there was an article, and they asked me to use that article to do my confession. And several times a draft go and come back between me and interrogators, and then they brought to a group of experts, a group of interrogators. They sent me back and asked me to do some corrections. And after several times it went. And finally they took me in the front of the camera, and I read from the papers what we prepared and in the prison. And also I think 4 times, every time between 7 and 8 hours, we examine and practice in the prison. And in fact, it was a field, exactly, in the field, but they appeared to the people. It's a voluntary interview by TV, and I ask myself. And unfortunately, right now, in some courts and also in some TV, that experience repeated for another political activist that right now they are in the prison, and the same experience repeated. And unfortunately, it's the very brutal policy of the regime that they use that. And also another bad experience that some activists faced in that recent arrest, that's the rape. And they did rape against boys and girls in the prison. And Mr. Karoubi, one of the reformist candidates, he struggled against that. He wrote a letter and officially and publicly mentioned on that. Unfortunately, the regime shut down his political party, his magazine, his media, and tried to prepare the executives to arrest him. And right now, but the recent rally in Quds days again gave energy to the people and momentum to the movement, and I believe that it's hard for regime to continue this crackdown.
Ali, thank you. Saad, your experience, personal experience, having been arrested, politically imprisoned?
Well, I was in and out of prison 3 times. The first time was the worst. because that's when torture took place, and that's when I lost my health a great deal. That's why I'm walking on a cane. I used to be a runner, actually, before I went to prison. I came out on a wheelchair, and I had to, later on, 4 surgeries in Johns Hopkins Hospital in order to be able to just stand. However, after that first experience, my case became a cause célèbre. And it is the second time and the third time that Western democracies began to exert pressure on the Mubarak regime. And there was the usual, the regime said, oh, see, Western countries, especially the US, is defending him. It shows that he's an agent, a foreign agent. This was actually one of the charges. However, inside the prison itself, it was an interesting, because when President Bush suspended $150 million from the American aid to the Mubarak regime, and the prisoners read about it, I said, oh, you are worth $150 million? And all of a sudden, my stocks in prison shot. And this is not a laughing matter, because usually it is killers who are the most respected in prison and feared, followed by drug dealers who have a lot of money and they can bribe everybody and they can have a lot of comfort and a lot of amenities in prison. And then comes a distant third, political prisoners like myself. However, that was the exception. When a political prisoner was talked about as being worth $150 million, I topped both the drug dealers and the killers. And then 9/11 happened when I was in prison, in my second imprisonment. And that was very interesting, because once the Bush administration began to do, bombing of Afghanistan, a lot of prisoners in one of the cell block began to request and to pressure the prison authority to be transferred to my cell block. Again, believing the government allegation that I'm really an American agent. And therefore, if Americans are so they may bomb their own cell block, but they will not bomb the cell block I was in. So the prison authorities actually had to plead with me to explain that this is not going to happen, because there was no room in my cell block for all of those people who requested. So there were some very interesting episodes. Being a sociologist, of course, I put my own sociological imagination to work in prison in order to make the experience at least palatable and useful, especially because in my case, I had been to that prison 3 times before my case. The first time, when I was doing my research on Islamic militants, some of my claim to fame is my early work on Islamic militants, some of whom were in prison. The second time was a human rights defender. When I established a human rights organization, I used to frequent this prison and other prisons to investigate cases. And the third time, when I went as a prisoner myself. And surprisingly, I found some of the people I studied 20 years earlier still in prison. And they welcomed me, of course, in their own way in prison. And they asked if I need anything. Of course, I was in solitary confinement, by the way. But they managed to get to me through all kind of tricks, because I had been there for 20 plus years, so they knew the ropes inside prison. So there are many stories like that. And some are harsh, some are interesting, some are entertaining, but a lot of education, a lot of self-discovery, a lot of also understanding the system, because the prison becomes a microcosm of the society at large. And we have one here who was a director, a warden in one of the prisons, sitting there, Mr. Omar Afifi, and he can testify to everything I'm saying. So, yes, it was a mixed experience, painful, lost 3 years of my life. Out of the 7 years I was convicted, I spent 3. And then I was exonerated by the High Court. And the High Court is an independent court in Egypt, the only independent court that the regime has not succeeded yet in controlling. But otherwise, they have created all kinds of parallel systems to the judiciary system, like emergency courts, military courts, state security courts, and I was convicted initially in the first and second trial by one of those kangaroo courts called the state security court. But ultimately, when I went to the High Court, me and 27 of my colleagues who were actually put in prison with me from the Ibn Khaldun Center were exonerated, or where the ruling was overturned and we were freed.
Saad, thank you. It seems to me we've been very fortunate for a number of reasons to have these two gentlemen with us in this program. We, thanks to Foreign Policy Initiative, it was, I think, wise to have leading representatives from arguably the two most important countries in that part of the world. For reasons of population, I think Egypt is the largest, I think, with 83 million, and Iran follows
71 million.
71 million follows just north of 70 million, but also because of the real existing and potential intellectual importance, Sunni and Shia respectively, throughout the region. But above all, thanks to Foreign Policy Initiative, we have two gentlemen here in this program who are articulate, eloquent, and as the last answers underscored, genuinely courageous and have made and continue to make genuine sacrifice, something we can all learn from and inspires us. So Ali, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Saad, thank you very much. To Foreign Policy Initiative and all of you. Thank you.